Hi, and welcome to show number 33 of the Cafecito Travel Talks, a podcast where people share travel stories and adventures. My name is Tony Lloyd, and I'm your host. For today's show, I'm talking with my guest just before he starts off on his journey. He'll explain a little bit about his background and why he decided to make this move. But before we start, I'd like to thank all the people who've contributed to the program so far. And if you'd like to donate, please take a look at the podcast notes to see how you could do so. Please don't forget to subscribe to any one of the podcast providers so you get the updates as soon as they come in. Take a look at our Facebook page for the written stories, and if you're someone who likes to write or have an idea for a future podcast, please send me an email to elcafecitotraveltalks@gmail.com. Any feedback or comments about the show could also be sent to that same email, which is elcafecitotraveltalks@gmail.com. So please get yourself a tea or a cup of coffee and enjoy today's show.
My name is George Griffiths, born and raised in Canada, but raised by my Greek grandparents. I'm 46 years old and currently hold a position of Chief Operating Officer, a successful construction company here in Canada, which actually, I need to correct that. I resigned, actually negotiated a layoff this Friday. So
George, you and I actually met recently, or we've met electronically recently, because you sent through a platform called Workaway a request to come to Ecuador to volunteer.
Yes.
Where did your desire to travel come about?
Now that I think back at the stage that I am now, which we'll get into that a little bit later, which actually from conversing with you, I've kind of realized where this kind of comes from. Now that I realize it, I could tell you. So when I was young, I grew up in Canada in a French neighborhood playing hockey, growing up in a Greek household, speaking Greek, getting, spoken to in Greek as a kid. I remember my grandmother feeding me olives and teaching me, how to make sure I don't swallow the pit and spit it out. And grandfather, he started this radio station. So I was surrounded by multiculturalism even before I even knew what it was. As I grew up, I started getting this desire to experience different things, to go places. And I didn't understand what it was, but it felt like something was pulling me. It literally did. It felt like either someone was pulling me or like kind of pushing me out. And I've never quite, the older I got, I never quite felt like I was home. It's hard to explain. I never felt like, I felt like there was something else out there for me. And I discovered something in 2016. I was working for PetroChina. I used to work oil and gas, and I was working for the largest oil and gas company in the world. Very successful. I was very successful. And in 2016, the oil prices dropped, and essentially the markets crashed. And I worked for major projects. I got a layoff. While I was sitting in my office, I was lucky enough to get the information of my layoff a few months early, which usually that never happens. But, I knew it was coming. And there was somebody that I've been working with for 4 years, and we've had conversations, regularly, interactions, multiple times a day. And all of a sudden, I started discussing with him that, I think I'm getting laid off. I don't know what I'm going to do. And this gentleman brought something up to me. He brought up woofing, and I had never heard about that before. And it's like a Workaway. It's a different platform, but it's similar. So it's, volunteering, exchanging your time, et cetera, et cetera. That he traveled, him and his wife, for 2 years, all around the world, including, Australia. He had stayed for 8 months, and he only spent $45,000 in 2 years traveling all around the world, him and his wife. And he had expressed to me that he would have spent less, but he had issues with a vehicle. Anyways, I found it extremely interesting, and then I signed up. I ended up going to Greece. So I leave, I go to Greece, I sell everything. I want to go see where my grandparents come from. They're my heroes. And I wanted to really immerse myself in that culture and understand, where my heroes came from. And, I heard stories of the war, and, everybody had risked their life for their country. And I wanted to see, this amazing country that created these incredible people. Not to mention, when you learn a little bit about Greece, it's the birthplace of democracy, mathematics, all these, philosophy and all these incredible things. So I was sold. So I go there not knowing how long I'm going to stay. I stay for 3 years. I don't know, I can't explain it. It was, I was treading, uncharted waters. This had never happened to me before. I had never been unemployed, ever. Never been unemployed, never been in a situation like this, market crash. And I'm taking off to go to a country that I've never been to before. I sold everything. I didn't stick around to find another job. It's just something was pulling me. I had to go. So I go to Greece, and out of the over 250 islands, I didn't want to go somewhere tourist. I wanted to go somewhere where I wanted to be with the people. I wanted to know what it was like to be a Greek person, to live in Greece in an island. I wanted to taste the culture, feel it, smell it. I just needed that. And even though I grew up Greek, I wanted to see, the difference. I wanted to see the country, and if what I was living was actually, what's happening over there. It was surreal a little bit.
This is actually a common theme actually that we find with a lot of travelers that have grown up in international households. There is the expression TCKs, transcultural kids, and I touched on it.
Yeah, you taught me that, and I'm going to get into that after, but continue.
Okay, I've touched on it several times. We have a story of a Japanese Peruvian girl who goes to Japan because she also wants to have the experience. So similar to your story, it's about trying to connect that link of, okay, where am I from? That's really the question.
Yes, and not only where you're from, I'm going to speak for myself, but who am I?
Yes.
Who am I? And I never realized what I was going through. I was experiencing it, and I realized I was going through something, but I never understood what it was until I actually heard your podcast. And that's a true story. I had never heard of a TCKs. And when I heard your podcast the first time, what you described, it literally touched me. Like it was a surreal experience. I got lost in that podcast because there was like a big light that kind of went off, and I was like, that's me, TCK, whatever that means. That's me. And yes. I never understood. I could never understand what that was. I didn't even know that existed. I'm 46 years old, and I've been through a lot of stuff. And I never thought that, that existed. But having said that, after Greece, 3 years in Greece, I spent 3 years on the island of Kefalonia, which is paradise on earth, an essentially agricultural island that had just started picking up tourism. And I had a great time. And for reasons, after 3 years, I had to come back to Canada. It was strange, as much as I needed to get out before that, after the 3-year period, and based on what I was living at the time, and it was, I got married. So, crazy story. 3 months after I get on the island, I meet this incredible woman, and, we get married very, I know, bad decision, 3 months, get married, I know, but live and learn.
I'm not here to judge.
Yeah, we're not here to judge. I'm just being honest. I was living the island life. I was in a fantasy world, like a dream. Like I couldn't believe it. Paradise on earth. I felt more connected to the people on that island than I felt to my old friends back in Canada. As crazy as that sounds, I was over there and I felt like I was discovering myself and learning about myself. And it was amazing, until the divorce. And then when the divorce came, it was a completely different reality. And I kind of had to press reset. I wanted to just reboot, and I had to go back to what I knew. And what I knew was go back to work, go back to construction, go back to Canada, i.e. home, and, start over. And Tony, I mentioned this to you before, and I'm going to tell you again. And whoever else is listening, I literally started my life over after Greece because it was not a very pleasant divorce. And I started my life over with half of a backpack, and not these fancy 65-liter packs. I'm talking about, a school bag backpack with half of the clothes in it. And I literally started my life over. Started construction again, did the same routine again, went back to the script, right? What I know. At first it felt familiar.
What's familiar.
Yeah, and comfortable, right? And I was like, well, okay, well, I'm back, right? I'm back home. But no, as time kept going on, I kept having, even more like this pull. I like that. This is not, I need to go somewhere. But again, and then, through me thinking, what am I going to do? Where am I going to go? How am I going to do this again? And all the insecurity that comes with it, packing up and taking off and not knowing what's going to happen and not knowing what's waiting for you over there. And, when you're in your 20s, you tend to be a little bit more risky, and carefree. At 46 years old, it's a little different. Your mindset's a little different. You're looking sometimes for that security, but I just wasn't happy. And like I said, I'm running a construction company making very good money, excellent benefits. I'm not happy. And I had to come to the conclusion that, for me personally, at the age I'm at right now, you can't pay me enough money to not be happy. I just can't live like that. And I had sacrificed most of my relationships, the important ones, so family, and I have no kids. And I had sacrificed that for work, and I was done. I said done, I want to be happy. I don't, and based on my life experience, money for me does not correlate to happiness. And that's a fact.
Exactly.
For other people, maybe it does. I don't know, right? To each their own. But I'm telling you, there's a lot of millionaires that commit suicide. Out of my 46 years, I've learned one thing, that for me personally, money does not correlate to happiness. So if that's not what is going to make me happy, what is? So then I stopped worrying about salary. I stopped worrying about, where am I going to get my paycheck from? And I started trying to think, okay, I want to live my life. I want to live. It's not about work. It's about living my life. And I can't explain it, Tony. I think it's the universe. And you know that you and I, ever since we've been talking, I've been telling you that I really believe that the universe has been conspiring to put us together. I picked Ecuador, which is not the largest country, not the most popular country, not the most known country, not the biggest, tourist attraction. I don't know. I can't even tell you how I came about that, except that part of my plan was to potentially open and run a hostel.
Okay, so explain to me why you thought of opening and running a hostel.
So I found that I would be around, in my mind, if I opened and I ran a hostel, it would be a hub of culturalism, right? So I would be surrounded, or I would be opening up something that would allow people like myself to come to me. And, I feel that we're never better. We don't feel, you always feel good when you feel understood. When you're surrounded, like birds of a feather flock together, so when you're around people like yourself, you can identify, you're like, okay, this is who I am. This is who I'm part of, right? In my particular case, I realized that, I'm not a white Canadian, male, like, that's not who I associate to. I associate more from other cultures, from around the world that, have different experiences like my own. And I never realized that. I just didn't understand that. I would probably find more in common with, a traveler from Peru who comes to my hostel in Ecuador, as an example, who has a similar story. Maybe his father, maybe he's half Peruvian and his father's from Japan, and there's so many kids or people out there like that. It's unbelievable. And, I hadn't realized it until I listened to your podcast. You were calling me, you said it in your podcast, there's a calling out there. There's an energy. There's this common energy that all of us have, and we're looking for each other in a way that we don't really realize, because isn't everybody looking for their other, people that surround themselves by like-minded people, right? People that are like themselves, usually.
We try to find our community. So
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Your community, right? And I've never felt that I was part of an actual community. I never did. I always felt like I was an outsider. And that's just the truth. And, like I said, I've officially negotiated my layoff. I bought my ticket today. I am, nervous and excited, but not as nervous as I was the first time, but I'm just, and that's where we're at. And, Tony, I'm grateful to you because, had we not met and I had not listened to your podcast, I would feel lost. I'd probably be doing the same thing, but I wouldn't have an understanding of why do I want to do this and what's attracting me to live my life like this, so I just want to thank you for that. And, so for people that are listening, I've never met you in person and I can't wait to come out there and, and meet you, man. It's going to be incredible.
Friends and family, what are they saying about this move, about you wanted to take up again, maybe for the second time and go off to Ecuador? Maybe it was easier probably when you're going to Greece because you have the background, but now you're going to Ecuador. What are they saying about that?
And you are absolutely right. When I was going to Greece, it made sense. It was easy for people that aren't living what I'm living, for people that aren't TCKs, it was easy for them to understand why I was going to Greece. My family, I grew up Greek, my background makes sense, and now I'm going through the same thing, except I'm not going to Greece. I need to see something different. And the closest friend that I have, I've known him since I was 5 years old. And, when you care about somebody, he just wants to make sure I'm happy, right? So he's like, look, if that's going to make you happy, but he's worried about me. He's like, well, what are you going to do? What's your plan? What are you going to stay? And what about work? And all that stuff. And, what I told him is, all I'm telling you is I need to go here. I can't explain it. I can't draw it. I can't, I might not be able to explain it in a way where people can understand, but it's inside. It's something that's driving me. I need to go. And okay. You and I, we had this discussion. Like you said, George, maybe you end up back in Canada. Who knows? Yeah, maybe I do. But maybe it's in 20 years or in 50 years, or I don't know, or maybe I don't. Maybe my significant other is, you know, the female version similar to me, which is multicultural and she's somewhere else and we meet, you know, in another country. I mean, I don't know. But, you know, I'm on a mission to be happy. In order for me to be happy, I got to go. You know, your true friends, that's all they really care about is if they see you're safe and you're happy, well, you know, they should be supportive. And, you know, I've had friends that told me, listen, when you come back, if you need to go to work, I got friends that, you know, are in, you know, good positions in different companies. And they told me, they said, listen, you know, you come back and, you know, you could always have a place here. And, you know, and I tell them, thank you, but, you know, I'm not planning on coming back. You know, yes, is it a possibility? For sure. And that's as simple as I can put it.
Family, what's your family saying about this move?
So, you know, my mother, you spoke to my mother. And, you know, one thing that I am blessed with, so the radio station that my grandfather started working on, Mike 105, you don't mind if I do a little bit of a advertising?
No, go ahead. We can
105.1 FM in Montreal, Mike FM. So you can stream that online if, you know, if the listeners want to have a listen. And it's a multicultural radio station. My mother was a visionary. So 40 years ago, when she started, you know, helping my grandfather and actually running the station, she realized that Montreal specifically, is a pool of multiculturalism. And it was so 40 years ago. And she visualized that in the future, there is no more English or French advertising. It's not English or French. It's Canadian, you know? And the new picture of Canada is multiculturalism. I give you an example of the Greeks. The first generation Greeks that immigrated here, example, my grandparents, they had my mother. So my mother was Greek also, 3 years old, but she married a Canadian and they had a kid, and that's me. Now multiply that by the thousands of families that came, you know, so my mother happened to marry an Irishman. Well, the other Greek happened to marry a Jamaican, and the other Greek happened to marry a Korean that was here. So now all of these families are having kids. So when the Korean Greek in Canada has a kid, what's the kid?
Exactly. Once again, we're a pool of TCKs.
And every generation, you know, as the further we go down this road, it's just going to end up becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's just the way it is.
So basically your mother's viewpoint was, go ahead, go for it.
Yeah, she's like, good idea. You know, she's like, that's a good idea. She's like, you know, if that's what makes you happy, you know, go for it. And again, you know, when I talk to my mother about, you know, me, you, and the kind of stuff that I'm going through, I think it makes sense to her because without her having to verbalize it to me, but now that I'm older and I realize how she grew up, you know, a 3-year-old girl, you know, my grandparents immigrated from Greece after the Second World War. They didn't come with a duffel bag full of cash. I could tell you that, you know, but they came with a hell of a work ethic, and that's where I got my work ethic from. And they succeeded and they raised a family, and we never needed for anything. You know, my mother, having lived in a French neighborhood, growing up in, you know, the Greek home, she experienced what I experienced, but maybe even more so, you know, because at the end of the day, I was born in Canada. My mother wasn't. So, you know, my mother was an immigrant, you know, being reminded every day that she was an immigrant in this country. I think that because of that, she can relate to what I'm going through, and she understands, and she's like, you know what, go. You know, go.
And I think also there was a whole point back in time where it was like, no, this is the script. This is where you're supposed to go. We immigrated to this country. Now you have to try to follow the road in this direction. Going off the trail is not the thing to do.
Yes. And you know what? And I give you an example, if my mother would have tried to go off the trail, she probably would have not been supported by my grandparents. Because like you said, my grandparents, it was very simple. You know, they came after a war. You know, my grandfather used to tell me to have a job is a privilege. Be a good person. You know, go to work, pay your taxes, go to work. And that was the script, you know, go to work, raise a family, you know, and it was that. And that's what they were. And that's what my mother did. My mother's a workaholic. And, you know, we've had this discussion, you know, like she lived the script. And, you know, my mother, you know, you get to a certain point where like, that's all she knows now, you know, and sometimes I kind of feel for her because she sacrificed personal relationships for work also. And, you know, so I see my mom, and in a way, and I don't mean this in a bad way because I have the ultimate respect. I have tons of respect for my mom. I don't want to end up like her. You know, I'm not living to pay taxes and die. Forget it. You know, and I'm not going to sacrifice, you know, what I today believe to be the most important thing. And that's personal relationships. You know, being with someone or being surrounded by like-minded people, being able to share experiences, good and bad, you know, that's part of joy. You know, that's part of being happy, you know, and I've learned that from travel, you know, and then, you know, my problem was, well, okay, I got to go back to work. So if I'm taking a week off and I'm on vacation, well, now I got to go back to work, you know? And then I got to go
Okay.
back to the routine, back to the same routine, right?
Also told me that your sister has also moved away.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah. So crazy thing is her Canadian husband, well, actually, he was Russian immigrant in Canada,
Yes.
right? So he's a Russian immigrant in Canada. My sister, her mother's, my mother is Greek. Anyway, so she gets married. I have 3 nieces and a nephew. They're in Jamaica. And she opened up a bakery. She loved sourdough bread. There was no sourdough bread in Kingston. And now it's called Eleni's Bakery, Eleni. Eleni's Bakery in Kingston, Jamaica. It's the most popular bakery in the country. It's actually incredible. And I'm so happy.
Okay. So if there's anyone listening to us that's going to go to Kingston, Jamaica, please check in and to the bakery.
And say hello to my sister from her brother George.
Okay, will do. So how did you go about, you said you randomly chose Ecuador, but then how did you find out where to go, how to connect to a place in Ecuador?
So when I did the woofing, I was also told about this platform called Workaway. And then when I started looking at the Workaway platform, I realized that there was a lot more options and a lot more diversity, different things. And I used my previous experience, with the woofing, to prepare myself to take off on Workaway. And again, I did the same thing. I signed up to Workaway and I started searching hostels because I had this desire, like I said, I could see myself working, in a hostel, whether I own it or not. I like to help people. I like to make people happy and, communicating and this and that. And I just, like I tell you, it's crazy as it sounds, but for some reason, Ecuador just kept coming up. And I've never seen pictures of Ecuador, Tony. Never. And yeah, and long story short, I punch in keywords hostel. A few hostels will come up. I would let people know about myself, and that's how it works. You put a little description, a little bit of your background, what kind of things are you handy at, what can you do, and next thing I know, one of those hostels was yours. And
is there something that you're like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna miss this?
I got to be honest. And yesterday, the only thing, this is gonna sound funny, but so yesterday I'm lying in my bed, right? I bought this memory foam mattress, and I'm lying in my mattress. And I'm thinking, oh, wow, this is comfortable. That's why I bought it, because it's extremely comfortable. Uh-huh. And I was thinking to myself that I got layovers, in Mexico City. I got a 17-hour layover in Lima. I was thinking, I'm going to be sleeping somewhere, and I'm going to miss my mattress. And that's the only thing that, that little thing in my mind was those little comforts of, your things, my mattress, my stuff. I set up my little space here the way I want it. And that's the only thing, like the mattress and it sounds silly, right? But it's the mattress and my French press coffee machine. And
okay, well, you can bring your French press coffee.
I know. I know. But you and I were talking, and that's, you remember when the other person brought out a blender? I don't want to bring the French press coffee machine, right? Now that I actually bought the ticket and I'm counting the days, it's like I swear, sometimes I get anxiety. I want to leave so bad. So I really don't think I'm going to miss anything. I understand that I might not be sleeping on memory foam mattresses in the next few years, but that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make.
Okay, there's going to be different people listening to us. Some of the people that are listening to us have already made this journey. They understand exactly what you're talking about. They've done it. Some of them probably have returned home already, and maybe they're thinking of doing a second journey out. I just want you to send out a message right now for the people who are sitting there in their office or somewhere along the way, driving in their car, listening to us, and they haven't made this move yet. What could you say to them to help them realize that this is a possible move for them?
I would say, don't be afraid. For me, I realized that people tend to be more comfortable in what they know, and nobody likes change. Even if it's positive. It's the funniest thing. I've managed projects and large scopes of work, and the last project I managed was $3.6 billion project. I've been involved in with a lot of people, like big teams, and I've noticed that on every level, when you try to implement change, there's always pushback, even if it's for positive reasons, even if it's even if you can show on paper that this is good for everybody. There's always some people that just aren't comfortable with change. Actually, most people aren't, and I will not let my life be limited by my fear. To get up at 46 years old and to grab 2 bags and to put everything else in storage and to go to a country you've never been before comes with a certain level of, let's call it fear. A certain level of fear, a certain level of fright. And don't let your fear keep you from living the life you've always wanted. That's the only thing I can say. And if you don't take that chance, if you don't just, grab the bag and go, do it, try it. If you don't do that, you'll never know. And I can tell you, it's better to have tried and failed than to have never tried at all, because you're going to live the rest of your life thinking, what would have happened? What could have come out of that, right? Get out of your comfort zone and try something, right? Grab a ticket. If you're not sure, pick randomly, pick a country, someplace, it doesn't matter where it is, and go.
Come to Ecuador.
Yeah, go to Ecuador, exactly, yeah.
We'll be waiting for you. George, once again, I am looking so forward to seeing you, meeting you. We've been talking. As you said, I've spoken to your mother on her radio program. I feel like we already know each other. So we'll look forward to seeing you. And then when you get here, we'll do another podcast so that people could hear from you and hear from you from Ecuador.
Sounds great.
Okay, so take care. Have a good night.
Have a good night, my friend.
Thank you for listening in. Hope you enjoyed today's show. And as we mentioned in the podcast, we will be doing a follow-up as soon as George is here in Cuenca with me. If you'd like to get a hold of George in the meantime, or check out the radio station, or maybe go to his sister's bakery in Jamaica, please take a look at the podcast notes to see how you could do so. Also in the podcast notes are the information and how you could donate to this program. All contribution will be gratefully appreciated. Take a look at the Facebook page to see the written stories, and if you're someone who likes to write or would like to contribute an idea for a future podcast, please send me an email to elcafecitotraveltalks@gmail.com. Any questions or comments, any way I could improve on in the show, also will be appreciated, and it could be sent to that same email, which is elcafecitotraveltalks@gmail.com. I would also like to remind you to subscribe to any one of the podcast providers so you get all the updates as soon as they come in. To all the TCKs out there and everyone else, we look forward to seeing you here at the El Cafecito in Cuenca, Ecuador, or our sister location in Quito. Bye for now. Please take care and stay safe.